Since 1993, the UFC has really come into its own in terms of the sporting world. It used to be a niche, unwanted, brutal, human cockfighting. That was the label here. The black sheep of the sporting world. And since then, the UFC has grown to such heights that many that were involved early on could never imagine. And so, along with a growing business, comes the increase of the pay-per-view price. So, let's run it down, because Mark Shapiro from TKO, the president, recently at the TKO earnings call, revealed some interesting information to us, and I wanted to just get into it and break it down, because pay-per-views today are quite expensive. So, I have a graphic up on the screen for you here. In 2004, the UFC price was $29.95. In April 2005, this was bumped up to $35.95. A $5 increase. In 2006, the next year, $39.95, another $5 increase. In 2008, a $45.95 increase, increase of $5. The next year, 2009, it jumped up a whole $10 to $54.99, and this is where I remember getting into MMA back when it was $55.99, watching it with my dad, enjoying it with my family. In 2015, the prices were had risen to $59.99, another $5 jump, a small increment at the time. $60 was quite a bit of cash considering where we were at just 10 years prior. After that, ESPN and Disney purchased the UFC broadcasting rights, and so the UFC signed this broadcasting deal with ESPN in 2018 and premiered in January of 2019. And this deal was worth a reported $1.5 billion. The cost of a UFC pay-per-view at that time was $59.99, as we just described. The price point jumped up to $64.99 at the beginning of 2020. Presumably, this was because of the return of Conor McGregor, and Disney, up on high, through ESPN to the UFC, decided to make changes to this because they saw, as casual viewers of the sport, that Conor McGregor was coming back and they could charge a premium on the pay-per-view. In 2021, when Conor made his return again against Dustin Poirier in January, the ESPN once again raised the prices to $69.99. In 2022, ESPN bumped that price up to $74.99. Now again, this is not the final metric. In 2023, January, the cost of a UFC pay-per-view went up to $79.99. So at this point, it was essentially an $85 pay-per-view including tax. Now, what does that mean? Basically, over a 20-year period, we went from $30 to $80. You may be saying, okay, that's understandable. Back in 2004, the sport and UFC in general was not in the same place it was today. The growth of Pride with being a competitor had some influence on that, I can imagine. The growth and rise of Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor in that 2015 year period, that kind of area when they were in their peak of popularity, crossing over into mainstream media, doing interviews on national TV. But the issue comes with what Mark Shapiro had. Again, TKO president, this is Mark Shapiro, here's an image of him. ESPN and Disney were very aggressive on the pricing of the UFC pay-per-views. And they have full control over that, right? They have the distribution on ESPN that charges the price. Given what they are paying for those rights, they have the ability to change the prices of the pay-per-view. I'm not sure how much that is true from a UFC perspective, but I would gander to say that the UFC, or that Disney wants the UFC demographic, that fan base of younger male audience, the athletic, sport-minded fans of the UFC and MMA in general, because Disney's fan base is more of the, what's the right word, nerdy, more fanatic. They like the Marvel movies and comics and books and movies and Star Wars and just kind of nerd fan culture, movie culture in general. That isn't the exact same fan base as the sports world. So Disney was trying to capitalize upon that, and I think they tried to take advantage of the paying fans that wanted to see Conor McGregor, the casual younger men that wanted to pay the pay-per-view price, get together with their friends, and buy pay-per-views. Younger male audience is what they were going for. Mark Shapiro continues with saying, they probably went a little quicker and a little higher than they would have liked. We, the UFC, and Mark Shapiro voiced that to them, especially in the era of piracy, where we're seeing our piracy numbers really jacked up, and we think that's driven by them pricing it too high. This is partially true, but this is also has to do with the fact that everybody now has a smartphone. All around the world, more and more people are getting smartphones, so it's easier and easier to pirate things and find them online. This is also an issue. They were very receptive to that feedback, allegedly. Although, they started hiking up the prices in 2018, and then again in 2020, and then in 2021, and in 2022, and then every year since, except for 2024, this current year, they kept increasing that price. So, were they very receptive to that, or not, is my question. Let's look at this article written all the way back in 2012 on Bleacher Report. Are children now the most important demographic for the UFC to focus on? And again, this was written before the rise of Ronda Rousey, before the rise of Conor McGregor, so let's get into the article. The males age 18 to 34 demographic will always be the core of the UFC's viewership, of course, because it is a violent, aggressive sport. Older generation doesn't understand what MMA is, and most younger children and their parents don't want those children watching this kind of dramatic display of violence, and that's okay. It's also crucial to focus on the children, they say here. While some might scoff and be perplexed at directing the sport of fighting towards children, the shift in the UFC's audience will happen organically over time. Yes, of course, and we have seen that it has in small effects. But a lot of the growth of the UFC after 2012 was because of the rise of Conor and Ronda, and the numbers that they were pumping out in terms of popularity was probably really unpredicted from the UFC's perspective. The majority of UFC fans, they are aged 18 to 34. The UFC started to explode in popularity with the debut on national television of The Ultimate Fighter in 2005. Yes, this is true. The fans who were 18 when the tough debut happened were now 25, and as the passage of time continues, MMA fans of yesterday will not only still watch the sport, but will also create the MMA fans of tomorrow by having children. Yes, this is partially true, and we are seeing the effects of that play out today. Having children being avid fans might seem like an important thought to some, but sentiments like that will fade in time, and I think they have. The younger audience that the UFC is trying to cater for is certainly there. And as UFC has come into the fold in terms of the entertainment world and just general pop culture, we now see that a younger audience is coming into the fold, and it is more popular. It's out there on social media more than ever before. But even Google's AI here, when you type in what's the demographic for UFC in a 2023 study, and don't take this completely literally, but I feel like it's very accurate in a general sense. A UFC survey, or not a UFC survey, but a 2023 survey found that 72.7% of respondents who identify as avid UFC fans were male, while only 30% of casual fans were female. I tend to think that most of the female audience has some kind of relationship with the male audience, whether it's siblings, significant others, or mothers even. But that is also true. The female audience has definitely come into the fold for sure as well, but not as strong as the UFC may seem to push it. The age group is 18 to 34, as we already discussed, but also 18 to 44 middle-aged men as well. 21% of respondents aged 18 to 34 were avid hardcore fans. So 21% of people that watch the UFC, essentially what this is saying, are hardcore fans. That's a pretty strong number. I know there's a lot of casual fans that step in whenever they see a title fight or whenever it's somebody popular, like a Sean O'Malley. They hear a lot about him. In terms of the generation, the UFC is strategically targeting Gen Z, again, with the social media aspect of things. because they're trying to attract new fans that can grow up with the sport, grow up with the athletes, and really create a core fan base that follows athletes along. The problem is they're pricing everyone out. Younger audiences cannot pay $80 for a pay-per-view, $85 for a pay-per-view. In America, kids don't have jobs at 10, 12, 14 to be able to say, I'm going to go buy a pay-per-view on ESPN. I need mommy or daddy's credit card. And guess what? In America right now, prices for everything are increasing, and the pay that they are getting is not increasing. So what does mom and dad say? We can't afford that. So of course that drives the kids to get creative and go on the internet, the iPads, the phones that they all have in their hand, go online, look up the UFC that's happening that night, and pirate it off of some kind of streaming service. You can't blame Disney for doing this per se. UFC has some pull in the matter. I'm sure Disney and ESPN are over their heads for sure. They have the final say. But you would think that the UFC would be talking to them and saying, look at all this pirating that is going on. All these kids that are now watching, this younger audience that is now watching, they can't afford this. In general, who can afford this? Who wants to pay for something like this? Most boxing pay-per-views now are $50. There are some rarities that are upwards of $50, $70, $80, $100, depending on what the event is, who's fighting. I would understand completely if the UFC implemented a new line of thinking, which was the pay-per-view is priced roughly in correlation to what is on the card. So a UFC 300, for example, you could have charged a $100 price point for that. Would I have wanted to pay that? Absolutely not. But I could see the thinking there, because the next month in May, it was UFC 301 with Pantoja and Usyk. That one was the same price as 300. So you line them up and put them up against each other, one next to the other, and UFC 300 was a spectacular event with the prelims loaded, main card was absolutely stacked to the gills, and then UFC 301, in which the entire main card was made up of a lot of unranked fighters that were not at the top of their game. Did the fights play out in an interesting fashion at 301? Yes, it was okay. And Usyk in the Pantoja fight, that was really good. Yes, that's okay. But the UFC did not know that those fights were going to go that way. They were not guaranteed banger fights at events. They did not know the UFC 300 event was going to be the most historic, one of the best events ever put on with the most exciting fights. Some of the best knockouts you've ever seen. They didn't know that. They don't understand, or they don't seem to relate this to the audience at all in terms of stepping back the price. Because once you get people paying the price of $80, $85 with tax, you've set a precedent. You can't really, from a business perspective, go backwards. It would be a great step, and I think the fans would appreciate it. But from a business perspective, trying to make as much money as possible, they're not going to go back. So it's funny to see Mark Shapiro from TKO, from UFC, speak like this as if, we just can't help it. We know the truth. They really had no problem with what's going on. They just have a problem with the piracy. And again, going back to the younger fans, they're trying to market Sean O'Malley, for example, to the younger audience. Well, Sean O'Malley, the kids that think the purple and pink and green hair is really cool, and all the cars and all the extracurricular stuff that he's participating in, those kids think that's cool. I myself, in my 20s, and my father, who's interested in MMA as well, and other fans that I know that are around me that I'm closer to, are not as much interested in that. We're interested in Sean O'Malley because he has a great, fun, athletic, exciting, bombastic fight style that you can't miss. That's why we are fans of Sean O'Malley. They're trying to push somebody like that to the kids. Well, the kids can't pay for the pay-per-views. We do. So why are you marketing things to those kids who can't pay for things per se? If you're going to do something like that, you have to give them an outlet to be able to get to these pay-per-views and watch them without being completely out of the loop when it comes to paying for a pay-per-view. They can't pay for them. Pay-per-views are expensive. So what does this mean? Going forward, is the UFC going to drop the price? I don't think so. Going forward, is Disney or ESPN going to step in here? I don't know. Their deal was supposed to be up in 2026, and I think that they signed an extension. What does this mean? Does this mean once they're done with ESPN, once ESPN is done with them, that maybe they go back to a lower price and have a subscription service type thing where they bundle pay-per-views and UFC Fight Pass, much like DAZN has? That would be smart, I think. Maybe charge a $40 or $50 a month thing, because subscription services are meant for you to pay for them, sign up for recurring payments on a monthly basis, and not have to watch every single time, because they know that you're paying a $40 fee, but you might not watch every event. That is what I would rather see from a UFC's business perspective. But I don't know. Let me know what you guys think. The story is obviously developing. We'll see. There's probably going to be some articles written about this. Let's continue to see what happens in terms of the UFC. Are they going to get stagnant because they feel there's no competition? Will the PFL come to rise and become a more legitimate competitor? I don't know. Will One Championship, as they're stepping into the American Western audience, do you think they might start to infringe upon the UFC's audience? Maybe, maybe not. We'll continue to see that and look forward to seeing what the UFC does